Most people think they know how the Great Depression began. They picture one terrible day, the 29th of October 1929, Black Tuesday. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange drowning in panic, fortunes evaporating by the hour, ruined speculators on window ledges. It's a tidy story, with a tidy villain, the greedy gambler who bought stocks on borrowed money, and a tidy moment when everything changed, the day the ticker fell hours behind the selling. And it makes for a satisfying story, which is exactly why it has survived for almost a century. But that story is dangerously incomplete, and in the ways that matter most, it is simply wrong. The stock market crash of 1929 did not cause the Great Depression. Let me say that again, because it matters. The crash did not cause the depression. The crash was a fever breaking on the surface of a body that was already sick. The disease itself had been spreading quietly for more than 10 years, through treaty rooms in Paris, through central bank boardrooms in London and New York, through the vaults of a French bank that was quietly swallowing the world's gold, and through the account books of thousands of small-town American banks that were built to fail. What actually caused the worst economic catastrophe of the modern age is a longer, darker, and far more human story than the one in your textbook. It involves a decision made by Winston Churchill in 1925 that chained Britain to a corpse. It involves the death of one man in October 1928 that left the world's most powerful central bank leaderless at the exact moment leadership became a matter of survival. It involves a Treasury secretary who believed mass bankruptcy was a form of moral hygiene. It involves a tariff bill that more than 1,000 economists begged the president not to sign. He signed it anyway. And it involves a level of inequality so extreme that the American economy had become a skyscraper balanced on a single beam. None of this was an accident. The Depression was assembled, piece by intelligent and respected men who were certain they were doing the right thing. And the most unsettling part is that the machinery they built has a way of being rebuilt again and again by every generation that forgets. So let's go back. Not to October 1929, but a full decade earlier, to the moment the old world died and a broken one was wired together in its place. Because the true origin of the Great Depression doesn't begin on Wall Street. It begins in the rubble of the First World War. When the armistice came in November 1918, Europe was not merely wounded, it was structurally ruined. France had lost around 1.4 million men and much of its industrial north. Britain had spent a generation of wealth and buried nearly 900,000 soldiers. Germany had lost over 2 million men and was about to lose something just as dangerous, its financial sovereignty. And the elegant machine that had run the world economy for 4 decades before the war, the classical gold standard, had been switched off so that every government could print the money it needed to keep fighting. It's important to understand what that pre-war machine actually did. Before 1914, the world's major currencies were all pegged to gold, which meant they were effectively pegged to each other. Trade and capital moved with remarkable freedom, and the system had a self-correcting rhythm to it. A country that imported too much would watch gold drain away, its money supply would tighten, its prices would fall, its exports would become cheap again, and the gold would come home. It was slow, it was sometimes brutal for workers, but it balanced. The war shattered that rhythm. And what the victors built in its place was not a machine at all. It was a debt trap wearing the costume of a peace treaty. At Versailles in 1919, the Allies presented Germany with a reparations bill that would eventually be set at 132 billion gold marks. John Maynard Keynes, who was in the room as a British Treasury official, resigned in protest and wrote a furious book predicting that the sum was impossible and that trying to collect it would poison Europe. He was ignored. France needed German money to rebuild and to repay its own enormous war debts to Britain and America. Britain needed French and Italian repayments to cover what it owed Washington. And the United States, which had entered the war a debtor nation and left it the largest creditor on earth, wanted its money back. Here's what that created. Germany owed France and Britain. France and Britain owed America. And America, in order to keep the whole thing from collapsing, lent money to Germany so Germany could pay France and Britain, who then paid America. Money was traveling in a circle. And a circle is exactly the wrong shape for a financial system, because it means there is no destination, only rotation. The moment any link stopped turning, the moment American banks stopped lending to Berlin, every payment in the chain would fail at once. Statesmen on both sides of the Atlantic understood this. They kept the loop running anyway because breaking it was politically unthinkable. American voters would not forgive war debts. French voters would not forgive Germany. So the most powerful nations on earth chose a structure they privately knew was a house of cards because admitting the truth would have cost them an election. Now layer the gold standard back on top of that. After the war, the men who ran the world's treasuries and central banks shared an almost religious conviction that civilization would not be safe until every currency was chained to gold again. Gold meant discipline. Gold meant the world before the catastrophe. And so, one by one, countries climbed back onto the standard. But they climbed back onto it drunk, in the dark, at the wrong angle. The most consequential mistake was made in London. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, returned Britain to gold at the old pre-war rate of $4.86 to the pound, as if the war had never happened, as if Britain were still the workshop of the world. It was an act of imperial nostalgia, and it was economic madness. At that exchange rate, the pound was overvalued by roughly 10%, which meant every British export was 10% too expensive the moment it left the dock. British coal, British steel, British textiles began losing markets they had held for a century. To stay on gold, Britain had to grind its own economy with high interest rates and falling wages. And in 1926, the pressure detonated in a general strike that brought the country to a standstill. Churchill later admitted privately that it was the greatest mistake of his life. France made the opposite mistake, and it turned out to be even more destructive. In 1926, France stabilized the franc at a deliberately cheap rate. Suddenly, French goods were bargains, money poured in, and gold began to pile up in the vaults of the Bank of France at a rate the world had never seen. Between 1927 and 1932, France's share of the world's monetary gold exploded from about 7% to about 27%. Add the United States, and by the early 30s, two countries were sitting on roughly 6 out of every 10 ounces of monetary gold on the planet. Under the rules of the game, all that gold flowing into France should have expanded the French money supply, raised French prices, and pushed the gold back out into the world. That is how the machine balances. France refused to play. The Bank of France sterilized the inflows, locking the gold away without printing the money it was supposed to support. The economist Douglas Irwin, in a study for the National Bureau of Economic Research, argued that France, even more than the United States, was responsible for the worldwide deflation of 1929 to 1933. His calculations suggest that if the major central banks had simply held their gold ratios at 1,928 levels, world prices would not have collapsed at all. Sit with that for a second. The deflation that crushed the world was not weather. It was not fate. It was a policy chosen freely by a handful of men in Paris and Washington who believed hoarding gold was prudence. For every other country on the standard, their prudence was a slow strangulation. Gold drained out of Britain, out of Germany, out of Argentina and Australia and Japan, and every ounce that left forced those countries to shrink their money supplies, cut their prices, and deepen their slumps. The gold standard, which had once been a balancing mechanism, had become a transmission belt carrying contraction from one economy to the next. And the one man who understood the whole fragile circuit, the one man with the standing to coordinate the central banks and keep the current flowing, was dying. His name was Benjamin Strong. He had run the Federal Reserve Bank of New York since 1914, and in practice he was the most powerful central banker on earth. Strong understood something his colleagues did not, that the post-war system was not a collection of national economies, but a single interconnected organism, and that America, holding the world's gold and the world's debts, was its heart. He worked closely with Montague Norman at the Bank of England. He championed the new tool of open market operations. In 1927, he cut American rates specifically to relieve the pressure on the pound and keep Britain on gold, a decision his critics never forgave, because they said it fueled the stock bubble. Maybe it did. Strong's calculation was that a wobbling Wall Street was survivable and a collapsing international monetary system was not. In October 1928, 12 months before the crash, Benjamin Strong died of tuberculosis. He was 55. And with him died the only center of gravity American monetary policy had. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, in their monumental study of American monetary history, marked his death as a hinge in the story. Power inside the Federal Reserve fractured, away from New York and into a committee of regional banks and a board in Washington, run by men who were cautious, provincial, and devoted to exactly the orthodoxies the moment demanded be abandoned. Charles Kindleberger, one of the great historians of the crisis, went as far as saying that if Strong had lived, the Depression might never have reached the depths it did. You should always be suspicious of history that hangs on one man's heartbeat. But the record of what the leaderless Fed did next makes the case hard to dismiss. Because now we reach the part of the story everyone thinks they know, the Roaring Twenties and the crash that ended them. And even here, the textbook version hides the rot. Yes, America in the 20s was booming. Factories electrified, output soared, automobiles and radios and refrigerators remade daily life. But walk off Wall Street and into the countryside, and you found a different decade entirely. Farm prices had collapsed in 1920 and never recovered because Europe's fields had come back into production and the wartime bonanza was over. Farmers had borrowed heavily at wartime prices to buy land and machinery, and now serviced those debts with crops worth half as much. All through the so-called prosperous 20s, 500 to 600 American banks failed every single year, most of them small rural banks dragged down by dying farms. The prosperity everyone remembers was a city phenomenon, floating on top of an agricultural depression that had already been running for nearly a decade. And the American banking system was uniquely built to shatter. Because of laws that restricted branching, the United States had roughly 25,000 separate banks, most of them tiny, single-office institutions whose fate was welded to one town, one crop, one price. Canada, with a handful of large national banks operating coast to coast, would go through the entire depression without a single bank failure. The United States had built 25,000 dominoes and stood them in a line. There was no deposit insurance. If your bank went down, your savings simply ceased to exist, and everyone knew it, which is precisely what turns a rumor into a bank run. Then there was the distribution problem. By 1929, the top 1% of American families were taking home roughly a quarter of all income. The top tenth of 1% earned about as much as the bottom 42% of the country combined. Something like 80% of American families had no savings at all. Wages for the men on the assembly lines had crept upward through the decade. Corporate profits and dividends had rocketed. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith, when he later listed the fundamental weaknesses that made the crash so lethal, put the income gap first, ahead of the banks, ahead of the market, first. Because an industrial economy is a loop of its own. The factories can only sell what ordinary families can afford to buy. And when the gains of a boom flow overwhelmingly to people who already own everything they need, two things happen. The rich pour their surplus into speculation, stocks bought on margin, Florida real estate, investment trusts stacked on investment trusts, and the middle pours itself into debt trying to keep up. Installment plans for the car, the radio, the furniture. Both engines, the speculative one and the borrowed one, can run for years. Neither can run forever. By the summer of 1,929 months before the crash, the real economy was already turning down. Construction was falling, auto sales were falling, inventories were piling up in warehouses. The market kept climbing anyway, because by then the market had detached from the economy and was feeding on borrowed money and blind momentum. So when the break finally came in October, it did not fall on a healthy country. It fell on a country with a hollowed-out heartland, a starving bottom half, a mountain of household and margin debt, and 25,000 fragile banks. The crash was the match. The gasoline had been pooling for 10 years. And here is the thing the clean story never tells you. The crash, by itself, was survivable. America had crashed before. The panic of 1907 was arguably as violent, and it was over in a year. The Depression of 1920 to 1921 saw prices fall faster than in 1929, and the economy came roaring back inside 18 months. Crashes do not become decades. Policy makes them decades. What turned this crash into the Great Depression was everything the people in charge did next and everything they refused to do. Start with the Federal Reserve, the institution that had been created in 1913 for precisely this scenario, to be the lender of last resort when panic strikes. When the first great wave of bank failures rolled through America in the fall of 1930, the Fed, fractured and leaderless after Strong's death, essentially watched. It did not flood the system with money. It did not rescue solvent banks caught in the stampede. Thousands of banks died, and every dead bank destroyed not just savings but money itself, because deposits are money, and when they vanish, the money supply shrinks. Between 1,929 and 1,933, the money supply of the United States contracted by roughly a third. More than 9,000 banks failed. And in the middle of this monetary asphyxiation, in October 1931, the Fed did something that still reads like a misprint. It raised interest rates sharply from 1.5% to 3.5% to defend the dollar's link to gold after Britain had been forced off the standard. Read that again. In the depths of the worst deflation in American history, with a fifth of the banking system already dead, the Central Bank of the United States tightened. They chose the gold parity over the population. The orthodoxy had become a suicide pact. 70 years later, Ben Bernanke, then a Federal Reserve governor and a scholar of the Depression, stood up at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday celebration and said, on behalf of the Fed, words you will almost never hear from a central bank. Regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry. And thanks to you, we won't do it again. An institutional confession delivered with a smile, 70 years too late for the people it happened to. But the Fed had help. Inside the Hoover administration, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, one of the richest men in America, was preaching what came to be called liquidationism. Hoover later summarized Mellon's advice in words that have never been forgotten. Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. Let the rot be purged from the system. In Mellon's theology, the Depression was not a disaster to be stopped. It was a cleansing to be endured, a moral correction that would teach Americans to work harder and live more virtuously. While the economy burned, some of the most powerful men in Washington stood beside the fire, arguing that the fire was good for it. And then Congress brought the kerosene. In June 1930, President Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, jacking up import duties on more than 20,000 goods to some of the highest levels in American history. The logic sounded patriotic: wall off the home market and save American jobs. More than 1,000 economists signed a public petition begging Hoover to veto the bill. Industrialists like Henry Ford called it economic stupidity to his face. He signed it anyway. What followed was as predictable as gravity. Canada, America's largest trading partner, retaliated within months. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and dozens of others threw up their own walls. World trade did not dip. It imploded, collapsing by roughly two-thirds between 1,929 and 1,934. American exports fell off a cliff, which gutted the very farmers and manufacturers the tariff was supposed to protect. And remember the debt loop. Germany could only pay reparations if it could sell goods abroad to earn the money. Tariff walls made that impossible at the exact moment American loans to Germany had dried up. The loop stopped rotating. In May 1931, Creditanstalt, the largest bank in Austria, collapsed. The panic jumped the border into Germany, where the banking system buckled and reparations payments effectively died. The contagion crossed to London, where speculators, doing the simple math, began dumping pounds for gold. In September 1931, Britain, the nation that had anchored the world's money for a century, abandoned the gold standard. The speculators turned and looked at the dollar. And the Fed, as we saw, chose to defend it by tightening a garrote around the American economy. One more act of self-harm deserves its place in this catalog. In 1932, desperate to balance the budget, because balancing the budget in a depression was another article of the Orthodox faith, Congress and Hoover passed one of the largest peacetime tax increases in American history, hiking the top income tax rate from 25% to 63% and raising taxes across the board. Into an economy with a quarter of its workers idle, they introduced a massive withdrawal of purchasing power. Every tool of policy, monetary, trade, fiscal, was pointed in the wrong direction at once, and pulled with conviction. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because the horror of the Great Depression is not any single mistake. It is the way the mistakes interlocked. You had a war debt structure shaped like a circle, which meant the failure of any link was the failure of all of them. You had a gold standard rebuilt at impossible exchange rates, turning the world's monetary system into a machine for transmitting deflation. You had two countries, France and the United States, hoarding the majority of the world's gold and refusing to let the mechanism balance. You had the death of Benjamin Strong, which decapitated the one institution capable of coordinating a rescue. You had a leaderless Federal Reserve that let a third of the money supply evaporate and then tightened into the collapse. You had an American banking system of 25,000 brittle, uninsured banks standing in a row. You had a decade-long farm depression, rotting the foundations under the boom. You had inequality so severe that mass purchasing power had to be borrowed rather than earned. You had Smoot-Hawley strangling world trade, and a tax hike strangling domestic demand, and a Treasury Secretary calling the strangulation a virtue. Any one of these produces a recession. All of them, meshed together, and each amplifying the next, produced something no living person had ever seen. The numbers are almost too large to feel. American industrial production nearly halved. National income fell by more than a third. By 1933, 1 in 4 American workers had no job, and in industrial cities like Cleveland and Toledo, it was closer to 1 in 2. 9,000 banks gone, and with them the life savings of millions of families who had done nothing wrong except trust the wrong small bank in the wrong small town. But statistics are anesthesia. The Depression, up close, was the father who left the house every morning in his suit to sit in the library because he could not tell his wife the job had been gone for months. It was children with the swollen bellies of malnutrition in the richest nation in human history. It was Hoovervilles, shanty towns of scrap lumber and tar paper, rising in the shadow of Manhattan skyscrapers that stood 1/3 empty. It was the Dust Bowl families of Oklahoma and Kansas, ruined twice, once by prices and once by the sky, loading their lives onto trucks and driving west toward a California that met them with billy clubs. Malnutrition climbed, suicide climbed, the birth rate fell so hard that demographers can still see the notch. And something less measurable broke too, the belief that the system left to itself was fair or even survivable. Now, here's a fact that almost nobody learns in school, and it may be the single most damning piece of evidence in the entire story. The countries that abandoned the gold standard early, Britain in 1931, the Scandinavian countries right behind her, began recovering almost immediately. The United States clung to gold until Franklin Roosevelt suspended it in 1933, closed the banks, and devalued the dollar, and 1933 is exactly where the American economy hit bottom and turned. France and the rest of the gold bloc, the true believers, held on until 1936, and they suffered longest of all. Line the countries up by the date they dropped the golden orthodoxy, and you have lined them up by the date their recovery began. It is as close to a controlled experiment as economic history ever gets. The thing the experts called discipline was the disease itself, which brings us to the fight over what it all meant, because the meaning was contested for decades, and the argument itself changed the world. For a generation after 1929, the common verdict was that capitalism had simply failed, that markets had destroyed themselves and only massive state management had saved them, the argument that flowed from Keynes and powered the New Deal consensus. Then in 1963, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz published their monetary history and relocated the crime scene. The market didn't do this, they argued. The Federal Reserve did, by letting the money supply collapse. A great contraction caused not by capitalism's excess, but by government's failure. Later, scholars like Barry Eichengreen and Peter Timman widened the lens further, showing that the gold standard itself was the cage, that no country inside it could save itself, and that the fetters were forged as much in Paris and London as in Washington. Kindleberger added the final piece, that the interwar world had no leader, a Britain too weak to stabilize the system and an America unwilling to, and that a leaderless system amplifies every shock. These are not just academic quarrels. Every financial crisis you have lived through was fought with weapons forged in this debate. When 2008 hit, the chairman of the Federal Reserve was Ben Bernanke, the same man who had apologized to Friedman, a scholar who had spent his career studying exactly how the Fed killed the economy in 1930. He flooded the system with money precisely because the men of 1,930 had not. Whatever you think of the bailouts, the breadlines did not come back. The ghosts of 1,929 were standing in the room when every one of those decisions was made. And that is what historians, or at least the textbooks, keep getting wrong. The comfortable version, crash, then depression, cause, then effect, teaches you that catastrophe arrives like an earthquake, sudden and blameless. The real history teaches something harder. The depression was chosen, not maliciously, but chosen nonetheless, by central bankers who defended gold while their banking systems died, by politicians who chose tariffs over cooperation and balanced budgets over employed citizens, by a Treasury secretary who mistook cruelty for medicine, by an entire governing class that preferred the comfort of orthodoxy to the evidence of their own eyes. Almost none of them were villains. Nearly all of them were wrong. And 40 million lives on both sides of the Atlantic were fed into the gap between those two sentences. Because the bill for the Depression was not paid only in dollars. Economic despair is political gasoline. In Germany, where the collapse arrived on top of reparations and memories of hyperinflation, unemployment passed 30%, and a fringe party that had won 2.6% of the vote in 1928 won 37% in 1932. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. In Japan, the collapse of silk and rice prices discredited the civilian government and handed the future to the militarists. The road that ends at Pearl Harbor and Auschwitz runs, mile after mile, straight through the wreckage of the world economy. That is what is truly at stake when central bankers cling to a dead orthodoxy, when great powers turn their trade policy into a weapon, when a governing class lets inequality hollow out the ground under a boom. It is never just money. So look around. Wealth concentrating at the very top while household debt climbs underneath. Trade wars declared by tweet and tariff. Central banks worshipped as infallible until the day they are hated. A global order fraying at the edges while every power retreats behind its own wall, certain that the rules that held the last catastrophe at bay are optional now. The generation that stood in the breadlines is gone. The safeguards they built, deposit insurance, the lender of last resort, the entire architecture of cooperation were written in their blood, and each one is only as strong as our memory of why it exists. The next time someone tells you the Great Depression happened because the stock market crashed in 1929, you'll know better. You'll know the crash was only the moment the lights flickered, and that the real failure was wired into the walls years before, in Versailles and in London, in the vaults of the Bank of France, and the boardroom of a leaderless Fed, in tariff schedules and tax bills, and the quiet arithmetic of who got paid and who did not. You'll know that the worst disasters are not the ones that strike us, but the ones we build, defend, and call wisdom until the moment they bury us. If this story changed the way you see the Great Depression, hit that subscribe button, because this channel exists to dig up the money and the machinery buried under history's tidy stories. Drop a comment and tell me which failure you think was truly fatal: the gold standard, the silent Fed, the tariff wall, or the inequality underneath it all. I read every single one. Give the video a like if you made it this far. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. And I'll see you in the next one.